welcome to another coffee break with Kardec, our weekly break for a cup of coffee, tea, hot chocolates, cold drink, and the time for us to discuss some points that we find in the book Genesis. We've been looking at some of the called miracles within the book, and today we'll be talking about the multiplication of the loaves. This is something that has intrigued me for a long time. I had just a few loaves of bread and fish, and they could feed the multitudes as large as 5,000 people. And I always questioned myself, and many people, I think, did, as in fact, what happened there? Was it really true? And the baskets, where did the baskets came from? If they had just a few of them, they wouldn't need more than a basket, and normally see several baskets full of bread, full of fish. But then it's interesting to see, because Kardec, and we're going to talk about the explanation that Kardec gives to us based on the teachings and the information that the spirits brought to him and that he presented before. And we've discussed it so many times, just to explain what, are considered miracles we find in the Bible and the Gospels. And today we'll be talking particularly about these two passages. One is Matthew chapter 16, and then John chapter 6, where Jesus mentioned bread, multiplication of bread, and then providing food to multitudes, to people. Many people have seen this as something that is sort of childish story, because to some people, when not looking to depth in the allegorical way that was very normal, very common to Jesus, they would see as a childish story, a magical wand, transforming few fish and loaves of bread into food for a multitude. And what Kardec tries to show us here, and I like very much his explanations, that when Jesus was talking about feeding the multitude, and in many occasions, as I mentioned before, that there are these two particular occasions that we are going to mention in the Gospels, Matthew and John, where he talks about the different type of food, the different type of bread. And he always used this allegorical way of talking to people. The explanation that Kardec tries to give is based on some ideas that we nowadays know, especially now with the knowledge that we have from psychology and different ways of analyzing human behavior. We see that when people are very happy, are very attracted or interested in something, they forget some basic corporeal needs. And one of them is actually when we feel hungry and the need for food, So just one very normal common example. When we fall in love, when we are young and fall in love, we forget the world. We forget everything. We forget to eat. We don't feel hungry at all. We are satiated with very little, because the important thing for us is, in fact, what we are feeling. And in many situations in life, if we stop and look at that, sometimes we are very disturbed by something. We also lose our appetite. And we see that the material needs, sometimes they are put aside because we have something on a different level that is really more important and is attracting our attention to that. Sometimes a question of attending, giving attention, looking after, taking care of our loved ones. If there is a greater demand, we even forget to eat. I've known so many people who said, it was so concentrated in that, I was putting so much of me into that I forgot to eat. And, if it wasn't for you or, for so and so, I would basically spend the day without, eating or drinking anything. And also we see the psychological support for people who need to lose weight, for people who want to engage and stick to normally a very strict diet, sometimes because they have a problem, a physical problem, and they need a diet because it's a question of survival, sometimes because they just want to lose weight for their own well-being and for their own physical benefit of their health and so on. We see some surgical procedures that are actually followed by psychological assistance for people to change the way they see food, change the way they eat, change their habits. So we see that when we are distracted by something, I call it distracted, but we are very much into something that actually helps us forget our physical needs. Our needs are less important. We also see that when we are anxious, when we are not doing much, first thing we want to do is to eat, or most people do that, so because they have nothing else to do, they go and eat. So the level of physical need increases, so the demand from the body increases. And I'm saying that because it's more or less what Kardec said in different words. That's why I invite you all to read this part of chapter 16 of the Gospel, of the book Genesis, sorry. We see that, we have situations where the food becomes less important, the drink becomes less important, our physical needs, they become less important than other level of needs that we have, and the spiritual ones are very important. And I would dare saying that perhaps it is a sign that our spiritual needs come first, or should come first, because we can overcome material needs just how would I say, giving attention and basing ourselves on our spiritual needs. Also, sometimes we are going to invite people for dinner, we are going to throw a party, birthday party, and then we realize at the last minute that we have many more guests than we were expecting, and we look at the food and the drinks, oh, it won't be enough. We have to go and buy more food and buy more drinks because, we have many more people coming and this food won't be enough. But then the party is so nice. People start to talk to nice people and they are so, how would I say, so very much so happy with the environment and meeting people they like and the level of conversation they engage into, that in the end there's a lot of leftovers because people weren't paying too much attention to the food. They were more interested in talking to people, in doing things, and perhaps even dancing and whatever. So showing that, physical needs, especially at this level of nourishment. I'm not talking about people who haven't eaten for many days, who are truly thirsty to a point that, they put their lives at risk. No, I'm talking just about people who have to skip a meal or something, or perhaps they haven't had enough food during that day, but, that won't compromise their physical health. But then when Jesus was talking, people are so mesmerized, they are so magnetized by his words, by what he had to say, by the nourishment he provided to the souls, that people forgot the need to eat, forgot that they were hungry. And that's why Jesus said that, they managed to nourish these people with just, very little food, bread and fish, as I mentioned before. And Kardec takes these two passages just to show that, Jesus spoke in this very same way, talking about the food that he provided to people, but not the ordinary food, the food that comes from heaven. And the first passage is the yeast of the Pharisees. This is in Matthew chapter 16, verses 5 to 12. And there Jesus said, I'll just get it for us. The disciples told Jesus that they had, they had forgotten to bring some bread. And then Jesus advised them to guard themselves against the yeast of the Pharisees. And then they thought that he was talking, Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then they thought that Jesus was talking about the yeast for the bread, because they were talking about bread. We forgot to bring bread to feed the multitudes. And then Jesus told them, they kept on talking, and Jesus told them, why do you not understand that I was not talking to you about bread when I told you to guard yourselves against the yeasts of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Because the disciples kept on insisting that, we forgot to bring bread and nothing to feed the people and so on. So he was telling them to guard themselves against the yeast that was not added to the physical bread, but the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And he told that was yeast because everyone uses yeast, for instance, to make the dough grow, to make bread. And if the yeast is good, you have a nice bread. If the yeast is not good, you are growing a dough that is not nice. And that was what he meant when he told about, the yeast of the Pharisees. That means that can spread, that can take a body, that can increase, improve, and creates a not very nice situation, because he didn't approve the doctrine of Pharisees and Sadducees. So he's clearly talking about yeast and bread, not the physical one, but actually their ideas. That once they spread, and you can control them. And just like the dough, they start to increase and go further and further. And if the yeast is not good, the bread won't be good. So the results wouldn't be good. That's what Jesus meant when he told them to take precautions against the yeast of the Pharisees. The other passage is the bread of heaven. Is in John chapter 6, verses 22 to 36, and then 47 to 50. And then again, the disciples, some people were actually looking for Jesus, and they went to find Jesus, and basically they were asking him about bread again, that there was no bread and they needed to feed. And then Jesus told me, we've just fed in two occasions. In one occasion he fed 5,000, and another occasion 4,000 people. And Jesus didn't need to perform that kind of miracle just to feed them with bread. What he came for the spiritual bread, and that's actually what he meant. So there in John we see, because I gave you bread to eat and you were satisfied. Work not in order to have food that perishes, but food that endures to eternal life. So, endures to eternal life, he meant a different kind of food. And then these people carry on talking to Jesus and talk about the ancestors that ate manna, the food that dropped from heaven in the desert. They are talking about Moses. And then Jesus replied to them saying, Moses did not give you bread from heaven, because they said this bread from heaven dropped from heaven, but wasn't a heavenly food, heavenly bread. Then Jesus told them, bread of God, for the bread of God is he who was descended from heaven and gives life to the world. He's talking about his message, his mission here, to come from heaven and give his message to the world, life to the world, as he said. And then further on, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. And because they asked Jesus, how can you prove? What is the sign of these, of your miracles and so on? Showing that they weren't satisfied. Just if Jesus had actually transformed a few loaves of bread and fish, into baskets of bread and fish to feed the multitude, that was a miracle enough to convince these people. But apparently in this passage, they were not convinced because they were asking Jesus to, give them a sign about, this mission and the message, and that he was the bread of life. If they had done that on a physical level, transformed, the few loaves of bread and fish they had into, a lot to feed all of them, they would have, seen that as a wonderful miracle. Yes, it's incontestable proof that you are the Messiah. But then they were asking. Then Jesus said to them, he said to them that he was this bread. He gave them the message. So in the end, he says, verily, verily, I say to you, he who believes in me has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate manna in the desert, and they are dead. But here is the bread that has come down from heaven, so that whoever eats it shall not die. Clearly, he's talking about his spiritual teachings, his spiritual food. His mission here was actually to nourish our souls and not to nourish our physical body. And people were so enchanted, were so mesmerized, were so lifted up with his presence, with his message, with his words, that they forgot the basic needs: eat and drink. That's how Kardec, in different words, in my own words, that's how Kardec gives the explanation for that, showing that the miracle was actually not to give enough physical food to feed people, but to give them the spiritual food so that they wouldn't feel the need to eat the physical food. That's what I had prepared for today for our coffee break. Time is up. So see you in another coffee break with Kardec. Bye-bye.